When I first started to think about new models of culture, I wrote a draft called Stories of the Skies to start to make clear that there were unexpected parallels between the great cultural systems of the world. What you see in Appendix 2 is a revised version of that. It's not, in the most direct sense, a description of the letters of the alphabet, but it helps you to understand some of the connecting features that are implied behind the letters of the alphabet. Key to this story is the Milky Way, which we find coming up in cultural artifacts in the most unexpected ways. Here you find the Milky Way expressed in an early bowl of Hungarian culture. But it's when we go to the creation stories that we find even more remarkable things. So, in your culture of the Indian subcontinent, we're of course aware of the story of the Devas and the Asuras pulling the great snake Vasuki and churning the ocean of milk, or the Milky Way, to create the world. And then there is the story of Vishnu lying down, and from his umbilical cord or umbilical cord comes a lotus, and from the lotus comes Brahma with 4 heads. If we go to Egypt, when we first look at this, it looks completely different. And now we have 2 gods representing Upper and Lower Egypt. They are pulling on a string rather than a snake, but they are again pulling, that string is linked with a column, and from that the creation takes place. And in another version we see Horus, and then there is a lotus flower, and from that lotus flower come his 4 sons. 1, 2, 3, 4. Just so in India, it's 4 heads coming from a lotus. Here, it's 4 little men. And sometimes they are drawn as coming from the Big Dipper, or the Great Bear, or Ursus Major, depending on your language. And again, 4 gods as part of the creation. Linked with these stories is then the Son of God. And the Son of God has a whole number of names. One of them is Sanat Kumara. Another one is Kartika. Another is Muruga, and so on. Typically, Sanat Kumara is shown as a little boy, and behind him an extraordinary peacock array. The story goes that he is the life, and the peacock that's behind him is a symbol of the Vedas. And sometimes we see him as Murugan or Kartikai with 6 heads. So we have 4 heads for Brahman, 5 for Shiva, and 6 for the sun. And he has 2 wives, who then are represent both wisdom, the well of wisdom, and so on. And again, he is riding a peacock, so he's riding the Vedas, or you could say he's basing him. The Vedas are his basis. When we go to this country, and we look around, we typically see peacock windows. Well, that sounds very peculiar until we realize that the peacock windows are almost certainly symbols of the Vedas. And so that this is not just a window to enlightenment, but it's the window to enlightenment via the sacred texts. And then in the stories about how the Vedas come about, there is this terrible villain or monster called Taraxuram. He has various names, but that's one of them. And you see him here. And then there is a tree, and the tree has to be split first into two, and one part then is the peacock, and the other is the cock, or the rooster. And that imagery spreads then right through Middle Asia. So if we go to the Kurds, they have something called the peacock angel, who is linked with 7 gods, and below you see the crescent moon, which we would, in the Indian context, link, in the Nepali context, link with Bindu. And then if you go to Turkmenistan, you find a similar kind of bird. And then when we go to Persia or Iran, this becomes the simorgh, which we see here in various versions. And if we go further north to Russia, he's called Semargl, or the firebird. But it's again, it's always, and in China he's called the peacock again, or the phoenix. And it's a bird that burns, and then out of its ashes comes a new life. So it's always the theme of birth, death, and resurrection. Very appropriate for today, Easter, which is also the day of resurrection in the Christian tradition. Or here, an extraordinary picture of a dragon-chested phoenix. And here, a Russian zodiac folk calendar, where at the top is a rooster. So the rooster becomes, in Russia, but also in the Christian tradition of the West, one of the key symbols for being awake in the morning. Well, if you live on a farm, you know that it's the roosters that wake you up. And but if you go to a Christian church, almost always there's a rooster on the pinnacle of the roof. And the story goes, of course, that Christ and Peter was, just before Christ was crucified, somebody asked him, well, asked Peter, are you a member of this group? And Peter said, the prediction was that 4 times before the cock crows, you will deny that you were a member. And then Peter, in his rage, then chopped off somebody's ear, and then they put the ear back. But in the end, Peter became the foundation. The names change enormously. So Murugan, Skanda, Sanat Kumara, Kartikai, it becomes Al-Qadir, or the green man of the Muslims, King Melchizedek of the Jews, St. George of the Knights Templar, Enki of the Sumerians, Dionysius of the Greeks, Osiris of the Egyptians, Quetzalcoatl of the Mexicans, Macaw of the Hopi Indians, and the planetary logos of Theosophy. So names that on the surface we would never even think of connecting are connected somehow at this deeper level. And in the lecture on the influence on Earth, I showed you that there were connections between the days of the week, the planets, and the letters, BGD, KPRT. Well, here are the Indic gods, so Aditya, Soma, Angaraka, Buddha, Brihaspati, Shukra, and Shanis. They become the Persian gods, Mithra, Ma, Verathragna, Tyr, Ormist, Orgav, Anahita, and Kewan. So, although we think of India and Persia as very different, there is a deep underlying level where there was cross-cultural influence right from the beginning. And that same Persia, as we saw in the introduction, when we were moving from the embryo letters to pictorial letters, the same processes that went on in Sumer went on in China. So there is, and the Chinese animals, not only are the Chinese zodiac in China, they are the same animals almost without exception. There are one or two that shift a bit, but basically it's the same ones that are used in Persia, Russia, and then in Europe. And then there are these extraordinary creation myths that are linked. So there are, it is Easter, we have the notion of an egg. But in the very old stories, there are two kinds of eggs. There is a premature egg and there is a regular egg. The premature egg produces Aruna, who becomes the charioteer of Surya. The regular egg produces Garuda, who becomes the charioteer of Vishnu. The premature egg takes 500 years to hatch. The regular egg takes 1,000 years to hatch. The premature egg produces a person who is lame. The normal egg produces a normal person. And from that becomes, is the starting point then of two different races, one perfect and one imperfect. Well, we have the goddess Deva, also sometimes called Diva, who becomes Div in Persia, from which we get division. And in fact, she divides and produces another 6 male gods. And then one of her other names, as a Yazata, is Diana, who becomes Diana of Ephesus. And here you see Diana of Ephesus. She's supposed to have 1,000 breasts. Well, I think there's a slight abbreviation, a compact version here, but still. But if we go now to the Egyptian zodiac, what do we see? We see the goddess, the star Canopus as a goddess, and she has exactly, well, here she is in her full glory, yes. And if you look at Canopus, who we now link with Kumbh and Aquarius, so the story of the water bucket or the water jar in this old tradition is linked not with a man, but with a woman, and links then with milk of the Milky Way. And here you have yet another version where it looks more like a barrel with a few leaks in it. But so at a very deep level, the stories of India, the stories of Persia, the stories of Egypt, and the stories of early Greece are interdependent. Not when you look quickly and say Diana of Ephesus and Deva, but at this deeper level, yes. And this applies across the board. So in India, you have a very important god called Narasimha, who I think is the, correct me if I'm wrong, Madhu, I think it's the 4th avatar of Shiva, of Vishnu, sorry. And here is one of his versions. Here's a more typical version where, so he's linked with the period around Leo, and he breaks open through these columns and comes out. And he could not be killed except by a certain kind of person. Now, if we go to Persia, we find a god Zurvan as a leontocephalic man, so a man with a lion head. And if we go to further in Persia, we have Mithra as, first of all, as a leontocephalic man, and then as this. And then when we get to Greece, he becomes Kronos. And then in yet other versions, we have a Mithraic Aeon, or eternity, god of eternity. Here is Serapis in Greece. Here is Veles in Russia, but in a version that also comes to the West. And if we take that boy with the snake around it, he becomes the Protogonos as phanes, and phanes meaning apparition or appearance, as in epiphany. And here we have Faravahar or Ahura Mazda, and his opposite, Ahriman, who then becomes, takes the form of what we would now call Satan. But in the early days, he is not Satan. He is a power of darkness that is almost on a par with the god. And if we go to Russia, here is Veles, who also is this dark side of things. And here is an early Russian drawing. And look at what the Russians say. Veles, Shiva, Set, Satan, Shaitan. So, and you notice that he's riding that bull in the same way that Ud, in that figure that I showed you in the conclusions, who is the male sexual potency figure. And then he becomes the Darth Vader in the later versions. And then we have a complicated god, or set of gods. We have Shiva and Vishnu as Hari and Hara, who then become one god as Harihara. Or we get Shiva as, I can never pronounce this properly, but Ardhanishvar, where he is both a man and a woman. And then we get Durga standing with a lion. If we go to Egypt, we see Isis standing on a lion. And we go to Turkey, and we see Teshub, the storm god, standing on a lion. So there is this extraordinary way. They're not the same person. They're not identical. But this idea of having a male god that is also female is also in the Western tradition, where we have, there are statues where if you look at them from one side, they're a man, and the other side, they're a woman. And there are modern equivalents, which we won't discuss here. But just to show you, here is Ardhanari in India, and here is Adonai of the Hebrews. Here is Mithra, who on the one hand has a sword and on the other hand has a flame. On the one hand, a sword and a flame. And then if we think of the Christian tradition, we have the two great apostles. We have St. Paul, who has the sword, and St. Peter, who has the key and the book. So you could say spring and autumn, or summer and winter, fighting and peace. But here we are in the East and the West, and this, although the names are completely different, although the imagery shifts, the underlying metaphors are the same. So I was saying that the imagery is the same, but something subtle does change. Namely, India has a great cycle that takes 420,000 years or more. Well, that's only in the Kali Yuga, that's the shortest of those things. But there are million-year cycles. But it is, in a curious way, it's always timeless. Because, yes, it goes around, but it always comes around to the same place. It gets destroyed and gets rebuilt again. And as we go through Middle Asia, Persia, something happens. Instead of just having timeless and time, we have gradations. And in fact, those gradations are fourfold. So we have a world of eternity, a world of perpetuity, a world of duration, and finally a world of time. Each of these with a name: Azal, Sarmand, Dar, and Zaman. A heavenly court, an Empyrean court, a kingdom of angels, and a mortal world. Lahut, Yaburut, Malakut, Nazut, or Olam 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And corresponding gods, the father of greatness is Zurvan. The next one is the first man, Ormazd Bai. Then the living spirit, Miryazd. And then finally the king of darkness, Ahriman. And in India, you have two creations. So we have a god called Vivasvat. And he has a first wife called Saranyu, who produces the first son of the sun, who's also thought of as the elder brother. He's timeless, eternal life. He's the first man. And he's also called Yama Vaivashvata. The second, and then there is a story that his relationship with her, she was too bright. And so there was a substitute wife brought in who was called Samnya, also called Shadow, who produced the second son of the sun, or a younger brother, in time, the first and he was life and first mortal man, and he was called Manu Vaivasvata. And so with this, you get two parallel stories of creation, which, if we go back to the zodiac, if you think of Gemini, there are two brothers. One is heavenly and the other is earthly. And all of those stories, whether they're called Romulus and Remus or whatever those two brothers are called, that all has its origins in this notion of two creations back in the Hindu tradition. And if we look more deeply into the Hindu tradition, many things that start there go elsewhere. So we have Vishnu has 10 avatars. He's sometimes drawn with 10 heads. And then we have this extraordinary figure called, we have 9 planets, of one where we have a god called Ketu. Well, Rahu and Ketu. And Ketu is drawn as a person with snaky feet. If we go to the west, we have a god called Yao, I-A-W. And what does he have? Snaky feet. And if we go to the Egyptian zodiac, we have Typhon linked with Scorpio. And what does he have? Snaky feet. And here is another picture of the same thing. And in fact, for the spring, we have Ichthon as a fish. Here we see the two founders of civilization of the Chinese, Fu Xi and Niwa. Here we have Olokun, and here's another version of Olokun. Another version of Ketu is to draw a strange V shape. If you go to the cobra, you find a curious V shape. And the cobra is 7 heads, sometimes with 10 heads. And you find many statues of this sort. There are people that claim that there are actually snakes like this. There are sites on the web that say that this is just Photoshop doing its stuff. But what is extremely interesting is that if you go to the Greek mythology, we have Hercules, and what does he do? He's fighting a snake with 7 heads. And if you go to the Christian mythology, namely Saint Michael, who is the equivalent of Kartikai in the sky on the 8th or the 9th of November. And what does he do? He fights a snake with 7 heads. And in fact, if we go to the Renaissance, to the time of Dürer, and when he comes to visualize the books of the Apocalypse, namely the predictions of what will happen at the end of the world, what do we see happening? We see the angel fighting a beast with 7 heads. And even in modern, here is a modern Christian trying to draw the dragon defeated, and what does he do? He draws 7 heads. So there is also then a fight between Christian and Apollyon, and here is Abaddon. These are more modern versions of this fight, and these same things come up in video games, but that's another story. Now, in the Indian system, we saw that there were 33 letters, sometimes 32. And interestingly enough, there are also versions of 36 gods, 33 gods, or 32 gods. Here is a version that tells us there are 32 gods who report to him on the good and evil done in the world. These 32 gods are the rulers of our higher natures as gods of this world. These 32 are divided into 1, an agent of creation, Prajapati; 2, agents of preservation and stability, the 12 Adityas, or sovereign principles; 3, the agents of destruction and transformation, the 11 Rudras; and 4, the spheres of their activity, the 8 Vasus, or elements. And so these various gods that get linked, the 12 Adityas, of course, get linked with the 12 zodiac signs. We saw that this is an evolutionary thing, that we start with 1 Aditya, then 2, and so on. And there are major and minor principles. Then we have the 11 Rudras, which are manifestations of speech from the mind. And then finally the rulers of space and controllers of destiny. And then finally the soul or higher self. So from the 32 or 33 letters, we create 32 gods, and we create actually an ordering system of the whole universe. And this same basic principle, as you'll see in one of the later appendices, gets taken over by other Mithraeus, the Mithra religion, and various other pseudo-Christian Western religions. And the Buddhist realms, there are 31 Buddhist realms, so which you will know better than me, and I'm not going to read them all out. What I'm showing you is that just as we have 31 gods, we have 31 letters, we have 31 realms. So the simple version is we have 7 Saptaloka and 7 realms, or 7 gods and 7 days. But so all of these ordering systems order space, time, gods, letters, the universe. And there is a fundamental contrast between two gods, Jupiter and Venus, or Brihaspati and Shukra, who produce one teaches the Adityas and the other the Daityas. One is connected with dead letter form of worship, the other is spiritual. One is exoteric, so everyday. One is esoteric or secret. One has exoteric knowledge, the other esoteric knowledge. One is exoteric ritualism, the other is esoteric mysticism. One is a preceptor of the gods, the other preceptor of the Daityas. One is speculative reason, the other is practical reason, the spiritual material, wisdom, and knowledge. And so the contrast between these two gods is a contrast that leads to the fight between the Devas and the Asuras. but it is a fight that is not a fight of one supposed to kill the other. It's more a question of two forces within ourselves that have to be kept in balance. And curiously enough, that at the religious level, we get a similar tension between Vashishta and Zoroaster, who are the legitimate son of Surya and the illegitimate son of Surya. They become linked with Indra and Varuna, the moon god, the sun god, Brahman and the Kshatriyas, the priestly class and the warrior class, the Devas and Asuras, and when we go to Persia, that becomes the Daevas and the Ahuras. So, and again, a difference between the East and the West. In the East, these are like yin and yang. They compete, but they are not meant, the one is not meant to destroy the other. In Persia, they are two snakes contesting, but never meaning to destroy one another. And then in the West, it becomes an either-or thing, a binary thing, where you're either male or female, you're either good or bad, and you either go to heaven or hell. But there is not this constant keeping in balance of the forces. The people who went from India to the West to become the Essenes, they were called the Nazarenes, was one of their names. And so they took, instead of the 7 chakras, they reduced this to 5 chakras. And so these link to 5 day parts. Then the 7 letters become the 7 weekdays, the 12 letters become the 12 months, then we have the 8 seasons and the 2 principles. And you can see how all of these link. And you again get the 32 sounds. The same principles used to create the alphabet become levels of enlightenment and also aspects of the yearly cycle. So the same thing that gets us around the year gets us around to enlightenment. And so we can take primal sounds like Om, Ma, Ni, Pad, Me, That then leads to the 6 worlds. And I already mentioned this before, but now you see that this creates a whole system. And that system can then be visualized. So primal man, or Adam Kadmon, as he's called for the Hebrews, is not just a man who lives in a physical man. He's a man who is as big as the cosmos itself. His central part is linked with the 7 planets, with the sun in the middle, where India would have the linga. And then here you have the zodiac signs. And that then gets represented in various geometrical versions. And then you get names for all of these. So you get the 10 Sephiroth again, 10 God names, 10 archangels, 10 orders of angels, 10 mundane chakras. And I can then divide that into the 4 worlds, the Atzilot, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. Here I have the 10 divine names. The next world, that becomes the 10 archangels and 10 orders of angels. Then the 10 planets. Well, the primum mobile, the zodiac, plus the planets and then the elements. And then the 10 orders of demons, the 10 archdevils. And so what begins as 10 letters or 10 divisions becomes a way of ordering the world again. And we saw those also link with the letters of the alphabet. So I can reduce those letters of the alphabet to 4 letters of Yahweh. I can reduce it to triangles this way, linking with the 4 elements. I can reduce it to the schematic form of the 10 Sephiroth, or I can create a more complicated way with all the connections. Or I can do a Simonian enology, where those same triangles now get linked with mind, voice, reason, and so on. Or I can do a geometrical version like this, where I link it up with that figurative geometry that I told you about in an earlier lecture. Or I can do the chart of the Orphic theogony, where I combine this now with words. Or I can take the 7 planets, have this enormous Seisha-like snake, and now link this with 8 modes or scales of music, 8 celestial spheres, 7 days, the muses, the elements, the humors, and even the notes. And you notice that this is a 3-headed snake, and such 3-headed snakes are actually said to exist in nature. So standing back, we see here the musical notes, but of course those can also be letters in other diagrams. And then we have gods that combine all of these things. So here we have Serapis. Notice that here he's leaning on a curious creature with various heads. Here you see it again, and here you see it again, and this becomes Cerberus finally. So the 3 snakes, snake heads, become 3 heads of a dog, and they represent then past, present, and future, and so on. Well then, a physical thing like the Ganges flowing becomes a story of the descent of the heavenly Ganges to the earthly Ganges. And if we go to the south, we see this in the form of an enormous sculpture at Mahabalipuram. And if we go to Varanasi or Kashi or Benares, various names, there is the Arti ceremony where all of this is represented. That story is related to the story of the heavenly God with his kumbha, pouring out the waters of eternity into the river of life. In some of the Renaissance versions, like this one, you will see that the kumbha is placed where you would expect the linga. And I will not attempt a full Freudian explanation, but the connections then become clear. Now, in the story, we are told that Kumbha's waters flowed into a fish, and that fish then becomes connected with life. Now, in the Egyptian stories, Osiris gets chopped into pieces, 72 according to some stories, 14 according to others, or it's 72 assistants that chop him into 14 pieces, and then his wife comes and collects him, but one piece is missing, namely his linga, and it's been eaten by a fish. And then there is a particular fish called the Oxyrhynchus fish that has eaten it, and that fish is worshipped in special ways. And so if you go to Egypt, you will find this fish in museums and worshipped. So there is a very complicated set of imagery that links, on the one hand, to astronomy, and on the other hand, to fishy things in the water, but all connecting the gods and fertility and death and resurrection and so on. I told you about the flower of life, and that the flower of life could be seen as a circle, then a vesica Pisces, then a tripod of life, the 3rd day, the 4th day, the 5th day, and the 6th day of creation. Essentially, we're taking triangles or circles and adding them. What's fascinating is that I can take a circle, add 6 circles, and then 12 circles. So 7 and 12 to get 19, that important number for life. I can do the same thing with mystical things, or I can add it here in the Persian. If I do it this way and then do it in terms of number symbolism, I get 39 in all the additions. And so, again, something that starts in India as a geometry, which we saw also with the Russians, goes all over the world. Here is an 18th century Sufi man called Sheikh Ahmad al-Absai. And what do we have? We have now the 28 letters called the existential letters, linked with the divine names, and then the descent from the metaphysical down to the universe. So this is the same basic principle that we had with the one I showed you earlier. So there are multiple versions of this, but the basic principle of linking letters, cosmos, is constant. And here you see two versions of the zodiac. We had those two columns, Yachin and Boaz, which represent heaven and earth. Here are Hebrew ways of linking the macrocosmos and the microcosmos. So now you take 6 zodiac signs at a time to create this funny shape. And here's another version of it. And this is called Ezekiel's wheel. So what is an ordering principle of cosmology becomes linked with one of the great prophets. And then we have here your chakras again, the rasis in the Indian system linked with the vowels. Here we see an Egyptian version, and then there is a man. Here you see the river, and in that river stands a man, namely Anubis in the river Eridanus. And so cosmological things get linked with the heavens and with elements and so on. So we had that, the 4 animals of the 4 royal stars that become the 4 writers of the Bible. In the Old Testament, you see a 4-headed creature, again with the eagle, the lion, the man, and the bull. Here this whole thing is called the cherub of Ezekiel. And then you see an 8-sided object, again now linked with cosmological things. And there are various versions of this, which then get letters again. So the same principles that we organize the letters with are there for organizing the cosmos. And then we go back to the letters. Here you see Hoi. Remember I said that curious sign that we link now with the control button for Apple that they stole from going to the culture sign in Sweden? Well, if you take half of that culture sign, which remember is also the symbol for John the Baptist and the 4 seasons, you get a letter in Georgian. This is the letter Johnny, and here it's also Zan in other contexts. It links with Zai and Hai here. Here is Aleph in various forms. Now, remember I said that there was a letter Chi, a Xi in Russian, that has a descent as a sphere and then goes back from the sun and then goes back to the star as a single line. If you look at the old letters of X, you will see carefully, you won't find this in modern textbooks, you'll see that the descending line is a thick line and the ascending line is a narrow line. And in the minuscule, as opposed to the majuscule or capital letter, the minuscule is a thin curved line, and then it goes back as a thick straight line. And then we have chi and rho. So the letters are not just letters, they are representing cosmological things in themselves. So chi rho is on the one hand Christ, but here you have Christ with an S in it, which is again the snake of Draco. And so it's representing the whole of the annual cycle, and it's these are the cross-quarter days, and this is the symbol also for, well, for Rho, but which we saw from the old Armenian, links up with more and with increase. So it's the Ka of Karashat, and also linked with the symbol for the ruble. And here you have Vi and various others. Here, just for fun, I take you through the same set of symbols and go through a whole series of languages. So here is Yin, 3 broken lines. Here is Isa, Isas, or ice. Here is Yang. Then I take that same Yang sign and put a line, and I have U, or the Mountain King. I take it and put 2 lines, the stick and 2 lines, and I have O, or support, or Opora. I take this and I add 4 lines, and I have U, W, or Ur. I have this and I have a Jed, or in Sumer I have O. In Old Russian, this is Madder or Hall of Fox. This is Samek. Here is Samek in another form. This is Jaikeb. Here it's in Tartessian. Here in Ugaritic. And here in Sumerian. Ladies and gentlemen, what's fascinating here is that it's, well, in a sense you could say it's obvious, you know. You only have 1 stick and there's only a certain number of things you can do on it. However, in here, at least 10 cases, you have 10 different languages, and they're all using variants on the same symbol, all the way from Asia to Europe. Now, another way that you can look at this, remember I said that there is a yin-yang, which you can see as complementary to each other, or you can do it as binary fighting each other. If you do it as complementary to each other, you have Ahura and Deva, good and evil, product of love and desire, result of a moment of doubt, unlimited in time but not in space, limited by time and limited by space, Ormuzd and Ahriman, Oromazdes and Ahriman, Ahura Mazda Angramanyu. So what in this version, in the Persian, you are already moving towards the complementary, starting to towards a binary where they're fighting each other. Well, just for fun, I thought it'd be fun to show you how this contrast can be found at the level of persons, places, events, and symbolism. So Adonai Yao, Belobog, Chernobog, bright child, dark child, Christ, John the Baptist, evangelist John the Baptist, God of the sun, God of the moon, Horus Set, I, you, King, little king. I'm not reading them all out. Perkonos, limes, depending on the culture. Capricorn, Cancer. The birth of Christ, the birth of John the Baptist. Midwinter, midsummer. Yule, Litha. Symbolism, earth, fire, feminine, masculine, white, black. And all of these can be seen as complementary and fighting each other. And then they start to enter into the names of things. So the generative and the generated, or the born. Yur and Yan becomes Yuri and Yan, and becomes a place called Yuryan in Persia. And from Yuryan, we get Yir and Yan, George and Johann. Here is Z in that 37-letter alphabet of China. Here we have that downward man in Ethiopian, yes? Here you see symbols of the, from alchemy. Now that same little man comes up here in churches in Russia. And now we go very quickly on our helicopter ride of the world to the Dogon Kanaga Mask ceremony. We're now in northwestern Africa. And what do? They wear that little man symbol, which, as we'll see in yet a later one of the appendices, goes back to the Surya Namaskar. But then they all jump in the air, because this little man is supposed to be the thing that connects them with the heavens. And so, and then we see the same symbol outside their huts. Here you see a variant on one of their objects. Here you see it on top of this statue. Here are variants that they wear. There's the hut one as a detail again. Now, why is this interesting? Well, because here are letters of the alphabet. Here is the Kanaga sign of Africa. Here is an Indus sign. Here is Indus rock. Here is a Mali flag. And here is a Kabyle flag. Here we are 18,000 BC in Armenia. Here we see the equivalence when it becomes a proto-letter. Here we see variants. Here we have the Tuvan dragon, so we're now in Mongolia. Here we see a version, a carpet with the Tengri symbol. There is the Tengri symbol again. This is Aegis Yalmur, Tengri, Sirdag, and finally the Vandals. And so we are back at the very first symbol that we used. The difference being that at that point we just saw this symbol that looked rather curious and we didn't know what it was. We pulled it apart and made letters. But now we realize that those pulled apart things can be put on your head and become the things for dances in Africa, letters in various parts of the world, symbols in other places, but part of a cosmic connection between letter making, meaning making, cosmology, ordering, and understanding what it is to be human. Thank you.